May 1942, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The morning sun threw long shadows across the test range as Lieutenant Edward Uhl braced the 5FT steel tube against his shoulder. In his hands rested what Army officials would later describe as one of the war's most revolutionary weapons, though at that instant it was little more than scrap iron scavenged from a heap, a wooden rifle stock, and a hope that the contraption wouldn't detonate in his face. 24 years old, newly graduated from Lehigh University with an engineering degree and 5 Beta Kappa honors, Uhl had been wrestling with an intractable problem for weeks. The shaped charge grenade in his possession could pierce 4 in of hardened steel. It could halt any tank the Germans had rolling across Europe. But at 312 lb, no soldier could throw it far enough to avoid being killed by his own target. The Army required a delivery system. They needed it immediately, and they needed it simple enough that any infantryman could operate it without special training. Uhl's colleague, Captain Leslie Skinner, stood nearby with a clipboard, observing through field glasses as a Mark V tank rumbled into position 300 YD downrange. Skinner had recently been promoted to major during the development process, recognition of his crucial work on what would become one of the war's most vital weapons. At 42, he was a career Army officer who had been tinkering with rockets since adolescence. Back when he accidentally ignited a hospital roof at Fort Strong, Massachusetts in 1915, his father, an Army surgeon, had been far from pleased. But that early fascination with explosives had led him to this moment, to this armament that would transform infantry combat forever. The generals gathered behind them had no inkling they were about to witness history. Among them was Brigadier General Gladion Marcus Barnes, Chief of Research and Development for Army Ordnance. Barnes had reluctantly agreed to witness this demonstration of what headquarters dismissively termed Skinner's toy rocket. The Army faced pressing problems. American forces were badly unprepared for the mechanized warfare sweeping across Europe and North Africa. While German Panzer divisions rolled through Poland, France, and deep into Russia, American infantry had virtually nothing able to stop a tank. Soldiers were being trained to rush up and stick magnetic mines on enemy armor. The casualty rate for such tactics was predictably catastrophic. The weapon Uhl hefted looked ridiculous. A plain tube open at both ends with makeshift sights, fashioned that very morning from a bent wire coat hanger. Inside sat a slimmed-down rocket with the shaped charge warhead. The firing apparatus consisted of a dry cell battery and a trigger cobbled from assorted parts. Nothing about it implied military precision. Everything about it shouted urgent improvisation. Yet this crude assembly embodied months of frustration, failed trials, and ultimately a breakthrough. The tale of how Uhl and Skinner produced what would become known as the Bazooka begins not in 1942, but decades earlier in the mind of an American rocket pioneer whose work had been dismissed as fanciful. Robert Goddard had developed rocket-propelled weapons during World War I, building prototypes that could theoretically grant infantry portable firepower against fortifications. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, interest evaporated. Why spend on experimental rockets when the war to end all wars was over? The research gathered dust in War Department archives for 2 decades. By 1940, with German tanks overrunning Poland and France, those files suddenly seemed pertinent again. Skinner, stationed at the Indian Head Rocket Laboratory in Maryland, began retrieving Goddard's old studies. The physics was sound. Solid fuel rockets could deliver explosive charges with negligible recoil. The difficulty wasn't propulsion. It was devising a warhead potent enough to breach modern tank armor and a launcher simple enough for mass manufacture. The shaped charge concept had been known since the 1880s, when Charles Monroe discovered that explosives with hollow cavities concentrated their destructive energy into a narrow jet. By 1941, American ordnance engineers had honed this into the M10 shaped charge grenade. Tests showed it could burn through armor like a blowtorch. One problem: it weighed too much to throw effectively, and mounting it on a rifle barrel risked injuring the firer from the explosive backblast. Skinner sketched a tube-launched rocket idea in December 1940. His superiors told him there was no suitable warhead. When the M10 arrived in 1942, suddenly the impossible seemed merely unlikely. Skinner assigned the launcher development to Uhl, who had joined his Special Projects Unit in June 1941. For weeks, Uhl experimented with varied configurations: how to shield the operator from rocket exhaust, how to steady the projectile in flight, how to make sights precise enough for combat ranges. The breakthrough came by accident, as many great inventions do. Uhl was walking past a scrap pile at the laboratory when he spotted a steel tube roughly 5 ft long and 60 mm in diameter. Something clicked. He picked it up, held it to his shoulder, and realized it was almost exactly the same diameter as the M10 grenade. The rocket could nest inside the tube. The open rear would vent the exhaust away from the operator. Put a rocket in a tube, point it at a tank, pull a trigger. The core concept was elegantly straightforward. Uhl hurried back to the workshop. Within hours, he had fashioned a crude prototype using the salvaged tube, some wood from spare rifle stocks, and basic grips and trigger fittings. The first test would be decisive. If the backblast was too severe, the weapon would be unusable. If the rocket detonated in the tube, the project was finished. He carried his creation down to the Potomac River, far from any observers who might question his sanity. He loaded a rocket, aimed the tube across the water, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket whooshed out with surprising grace. No violent recoil, no flame burst in his face, just a smooth launch and a splash in the river, hundreds of feet away. Uhl was astonished. He had expected to need protective gear, maybe a blast shield. But the rocket's propellant burned completely within the tube's length, and the little exhaust that escaped vented harmlessly out the rear. A soldier could fire this from his shoulder without injury. He brought the prototype to Skinner the next morning. Together, they refined the design, adding proper sights, improving the trigger, and ensuring the electrical firing system could endure combat conditions. They produced inert rockets for safety trials. Everything performed beyond expectations. Now they needed to prove it to the brass. The demonstration at Aberdeen Proving Ground was hastily arranged for May 1942. The Army was conducting trials of various spigot mortars. Bulky crews served weapons that also used shaped charges. Skinner saw an opportunity. He would demonstrate their launcher alongside these established systems. The comparison would either validate their work or expose it as inadequate. As the visiting generals arrived that morning, Skinner realized they had forgotten one critical detail. The launcher had no sights. The wire coat hanger sights had been a last-minute improvisation, bent into shape with a broken nail just hours earlier. No precision instruments, no careful calibration, just a rough approximation of where the rocket might go. The demonstration began with the spigot mortars. 5 different models were tested against the moving tank. Each crew fired multiple rounds. Not a single hit was recorded. The mortars were accurate enough against stationary targets, but tracking a moving vehicle proved beyond their capabilities. The generals looked disappointed, but unsurprised. Anti-tank weapons were notoriously difficult to aim under field conditions. Then it was Skinner and Oh's turn. Skinner shouldered the launcher, tracking the tank as it rumbled across the range. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket leaped from the tube with a distinctive whoosh. Seconds later, it struck the tank's hull with a resounding clang. The generals stirred with interest. Perhaps a lucky shot. Skinner fired again. Another hit and again. Another hit and again. And again, with their improvised wire coat hanger sights and a weapon assembled from scrap metal. Skinner and Uhl hit the moving tank repeatedly, while 5 sophisticated mortars had scored 0 hits. General Barnes stepped forward, fascination evident on his weathered face. The man had seen countless weapons demonstrations over 3 decades of military service. This one was different. He turned to Skinner with a request that was really in order. "Let me try it." Skinner handed over the launcher, walking Barnes through the simple firing procedure. "Aim! Track the target. Squeeze the trigger." Nothing complicated, no lengthy training required. Barnes settled the tube against his shoulder, squinted through the crude sights, and fired. Direct hit. The general's face split into a rare smile. He looked at the launcher, then at Skinner, then back at the weapon. The words that came out of his mouth would become Army legend. "It sure looks like Bob Burns's bazooka." Bob Burns was one of America's most popular comedians in the 1930s and early 1940s. His trademark prop was a bizarre musical instrument of his own creation, a long tube that produced comical sounds when blown. He called it a bazooka. The name stuck to the musical instrument and moments later to the weapon that would terrify German tank crews across 3 continents. Barnes wasn't just making a joke. He was christening a weapon that would become synonymous with infantry anti-tank warfare for the next 3 decades. That very day, standing on the Aberdeen Range with rocket smoke still hanging in the air, Barnes provided a favorable report that led to immediate orders for 5,000 launches into production. Not 5,000 for testing, 5,000 for combat deployment. A few days later, at Camp Sims, D.C., General George C. Marshall witnessed a demonstration before high-ranking War and Navy officials, Allied government observers, and British and Russian military observers. Marshall immediately issued verbal orders for 5,000 launchers and 25,000 anti-tank rockets, plus 5,000 practice rockets. General Electric received the contract on May 20, 1942, with an impossible deadline, 30 days to deliver 5,000 launches. The clock started immediately at G's Bridgeport, Connecticut facilities. Engineers worked around the clock reverse engineering Skinner and Uhl's prototype. The design was straightforward, which made it ideal for mass production. Steel tube, wooden stock. Basic trigger mechanism, simple battery-powered ignition. Nothing exotic, nothing that required specialized manufacturing. Just competent metalwork and woodworking at scale. The official designation was Launcher Rocket 2.36 in anti-tank M1. Nobody called it that. From the factory floor to the front lines, it was the bazooka. General Electric delivered the order with 89 minutes to spare. 5,000 bazookas ready for deployment. Manufactured in 1 month, the weapon received formal designation on June 14, 1942. E.G. Budd Company manufactured the initial 25,000 M6 anti-tank rockets and 5,000 M7 practice rockets. But having the launcher was only half the equation. The rocket itself, designated M6, proved troublesome. Early production rockets suffered from horrific reliability problems. Primers failed to ignite. Fins bent during transport. Propellant charges burned inconsistently. Too quickly in hot weather, risking tube burst. Too slowly in cold weather, scorching the gunner's face. The shaped charge warhead worked perfectly in laboratory conditions, but proved temperamental in the field. The electrical ignition proved problematic in wet and cold climates. The contact ring system caused structural weakness in the rocket. When the M6 worked, it was devastating. When it didn't, it was useless. This would become painfully apparent in the weapon's combat debut. November 8, 1942. The beaches of North Africa gleamed under intense Mediterranean sun as Operation Torch. The Allied invasion of French North Africa commenced. Over 100,000 American and British troop hit beaches at Casablanca, Oruran, and Allers simultaneously. It was America's first major offensive operation of the war. Among the forces landing were units from the 1st Infantry Division at Oruran, 1st Armored Division Combat Command B at Oruran, and the 34th Infantry Division, some equipped with the new M1 Bazookas. The night before the landings on November 7, 1942, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was shocked to learn that none of his troops had received any training on the new weapon. Bazookas had been rushed to North Africa so quickly that many soldiers first saw them when crates were pried open on transport ships. No manuals, no instructors, no practice ammunition, just a tube and some rockets with vague assurances that it could stop tanks. The initial North African fighting was chaotic. French colonial forces loyal to Vichy resisted with unexpected ferocity. German troops rushed reinforcements to Tunisia. American forces, untested in combat, struggled with coordination, leadership, and equipment they barely understood. The bazooka saw little to no meaningful combat use during the torch landings themselves. The weapon that had performed brilliantly at Aberdeen was failing before it even reached the battlefield. The first documented combat use occurred during the Tunisia campaign that followed. The 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Infantry Division received their first shipment of bazookas on February 12, 1943, during the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Soldiers learned to use them against German armor attacks on February 14, 1943, under the worst possible circumstances. The bazooka's performance in the Tunisian fighting was dismal. The unreliable M6 rockets misfired constantly. Soldiers who had never trained with the weapon couldn't judge distances or leading angles for moving targets. The electrical firing system proved vulnerable to moisture and rough handling. Battery contacts corroded in the salt air. Rocket propellant absorbed humidity, burning incompletely or not at all. After months of combat in Tunisia, Army Ordnance officers compiled a disturbing assessment. An American general visiting the Tunisian front in 1943, after the close of combat operations, could not find any soldiers who could report that the weapon had actually stopped an enemy tank. Not a single verified tank kill could be attributed to the bazooka. Soldiers reported firing at enemy armor only to watch rockets bounce off, fail to detonate, or miss entirely. In May 1943, the Army suspended further deployment of the M1 Bazooka. The entire program seemed on the verge of cancellation. Millions of dollars invested in a weapon that couldn't accomplish its primary mission. But Skinner, Uhl, and the ordnance engineers at Aberdeen refused to give up. They began methodically addressing each failure point. The rocket was redesigned as the M6A1 with a new contact system using wire unspooled from the rear, replacing the nose contact ring that had created structural weakness. Propellant sticks were shortened, reducing peak pressures. The fuse and electrical ignition were improved. The launcher became the M1A1, with a simplified design that eliminated the forward hand grip, added a face guard at the hand position, included a conical muzzle deflector and carrying strap, revised the safety mechanism, and reduced weight from 18 lb to just 12 and 3 4. The simplified sighting device had 100 to 300-yard range graduations. Most importantly, soldiers began receiving actual training. Target ranges were established where troops could fire practice rounds. Tactics were developed for two-man teams with a gunner and a loader working in coordination. By summer 1943, an improved weapon and better-trained soldiers were ready for another chance. The testing ground would be Sicily. July 10, 1943, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, launched with over 180,000 troops storming Sicilian beaches, supported by thousands of aircraft and hundreds of ships. Among them were American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division carrying the improved M1 bazookas into combat. Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 5,005th Parachute Infantry Regimental Combat Team, had trained his men extensively with the new weapon. Unlike the rushed deployment in North Africa, these soldiers knew what they were doing. They understood the bazooka's capabilities and limitations. They had practiced hitting moving targets. They were ready. Gavin later wrote in American Heritage magazine that the bazookas were most important since they were the only weapons the troopers were carrying that would enable them to engage the German armor on reasonable terms. The 82nd drop was a disaster. High winds scattered paratroopers across 50 miles of Sicilian countryside. Gavin landed far from his intended drop zone, gathering a handful of men and moving toward the sound of fighting. By dawn on July 11, 1943, scattered groups of American paratroopers found themselves defending a ridgeal line called Piazza Ridge against elements of the German Hermann Göring Panzer Division Eiger the I tanks from a company of the 215th Tank Battalion, along with Panzer IV medium tanks, approximately 700 infantry, and one armored artillery battalion advanced toward the American positions. The paratroopers were outnumbered, outgunned, and scattered. But they had bazookas. The first American soldiers to engage the German armor fired their bazookas at Tiger tank frontal armor. The rockets struck with tremendous impact, then bounced off harmlessly. The shaped charge warheads couldn't penetrate the Tiger's thick frontal plates. This was a known limitation, but in the chaos of combat, with 60-ton monsters bearing down on their positions, some soldiers panicked. Gavin later wrote that their bazooka rounds simply bounced off the armor plating of the big 60-ton Tigers, which replied with 88 mm cannon fire. He noted that many bazooka teams had pieces of bazookas ground up in them by tanks as they were crushed during the vulnerable loading and firing sequences. But seasoned NCOS kept their heads. They had been trained to target weak spots, side armor, rear engine compartments, tank tracks. As Tigers maneuvered, towing their 88 mm main guns to bear, American bazooka teams shifted position, seeking angle shots. Through the long, brutal day at Piazza Ridge, the battle raged. Naval gunfire from USS destroyers with 155 beams, 30 guns, proved decisive, along with the arrival of Sherman tanks. Lieutenant Harold H. Swingingler, commander of Service Company 505 PIR, and a former intercollegiate boxing champion, arrived approximately 1,900 hours with Sherman tanks and approximately 50 men from Regimental Headquarters Company. He captured the first Tiger tank intact by killing the crew with a hand grenade when they were outside the vehicle. Swingingler was later killed in action on D-Day, June 6, 1944. By evening, the German attack had stalled. The Hermann Göring Division withdrew, having suffered losses. At least one Tiger was captured intact, and Germans withdrew, leaving equipment behind. For the broader Sicily campaign that continued through August 17, 1943, M1A1 bazookas are credited with destroying 4 medium German tanks and 1 Tiger I. The Tiger kill was described in military histories as achieved through an improbable hit, reportedly through the driver's vision slot, though specific details of this engagement, including exact date, location, unit designation, or soldier names have not been documented in available sources. Gavin's after-action report praised the bazooka's effectiveness when properly employed by trained soldiers against appropriate targets. The weapon had proven itself when used correctly. News of Sicily's success spread rapidly through American forces. Soldiers who had been skeptical after North Africa began requesting bazookas for their units. Training became standardized across all divisions. Tactics were refined and codified. The bazooka was no longer an experimental weapon. It was standard infantry equipment, but the most significant impact was on the enemy. German intelligence officers interrogating captured American soldiers in Tunisia in early 1943 had first learned about the bazooka. Additional examples were captured in late 1942 on the Eastern Front from Soviet Red Army. Forces who had received them through Lens and Moore were captured in February 1943 during continued Tunisian fighting. German ordnance experts examined these specimens with great interest. The shaped charge warhead was sophisticated using principles German scientists understood well, but the delivery system was brilliantly direct in its approach. The Germans immediately began developing their own version. By 1943, German troops were using the Raketen Panzerbuka 43 with the improved RPZB-54. Model entering service in February 1944. Nicknamed the Panzer Schreck, or Tank Terror, and officially designated often RAR, or stovepipe, due to the copious smoke it produced. The weapon was essentially a scaled-up bazooka. It increased the warhead diameter from 60 mm to 88 ET, enabling armor penetration of 160 to 230 mm depending on conditions, roughly double the American bazooka's 76 to 102 mm capability. The Germans had copied the design so closely that American soldiers could recognize it immediately. But the Panzerschreck had significant drawbacks. Unlike American bazooka rockets, which burned their propellant completely within the launch tube, Panzerschreck rockets continued burning for 2 emitters after leaving the muzzle. This created an enormous backblast that could seriously burn the operator. German soldiers had to wear protective ponchos, heavy gloves, and gas masks without filters when firing. Later models added a blast shield, but this made the weapon heavier at 24 lb compared to the M1A1's 13 lb. In combat, that weight difference mattered enormously. American bazooka teams could move quickly, take a shot, and relocate before enemy forces could react. Panzerschreck teams burdened with protective equipment and a heavier weapon were less mobile. The massive backblast also created enormous smoke clouds, revealing the shooter's position to every enemy within visual range. Approximately 300,000 Panzerschrecks were produced during the war. As 1943 turned to 1944, the bazooka underwent continuous improvement. The M9 model, introduced in October 1943, featured a 2-piece design that broke down for easier transport, crucial for airborne operations. The assembled length was 61 in, disassembled 31.5 in. Weight was approximately 15.87 lb by unloaded. Metal furniture replaced wood. Most significantly, a new Magnavox T6 trigger magneto replaced the troublesome battery ignition system, eliminating countless malfunctions. The General Electric T43 aperture sight was replaced in September 1944 with the Polaroid T90 optical reflector sight. Rate of fire increased to 10 rounds per minute. Production totaled 26,087 9 units. The improved M9A1 was introduced in June 1944 with better coupling mechanisms for the launch tubes. This became the most numerous variant with 277,810 units produced by war's end. Most importantly, the M6A3 rocket entered production in late 1943 with a blunt hemispherical nose that prevented deflection of sloped armor. The new circular fin assembly improved flight stability. More effective shaped charge standoff and improved propellant made it more reliable across temperature ranges. This rocket could penetrate 3.5 to 4 in 89 to 102 of armor plate reliably at effective ranges of 250 to 300 wide-eyed soldiers who had cursed the bazooka's early unreliability now praised its effectiveness. The weapon became particularly valuable in the Italian campaign, where mountainous terrain favored defensive positions and made tank warfare difficult. German forces fortified villages on hillsides using narrow valleys as killing zones. American infantry advancing through these valleys faced machine gun nests, mortar positions, and dug-in armor in prepared positions. Bazookas proved a deal for this environment. The weapon could engage fortifications at ranges up to 300 YTD, far beyond grenade-throwing distance. High-explosive anti-tank rounds destroyed machine gun positions and light vehicles. The versatility exceeded original design parameters. At Cassino in early 1944, where Allied forces battered themselves against German defenses for months, bazookas were used more often against fortifications than against tanks. A rocket that could blow a hole through 4 in of steel plate could also demolish reinforced concrete imp placements. But the bazooka's greatest test came on June 6, 1944. D-Day. American forces storming Omaha Beach carried bazookas ashore in the first waves. Under intense German fire, with men dying by the hundreds in the surf and on the sand, bazooka teams advanced toward German strongpoints. The weapons proved crucial for reducing fortified positions that had pinned down entire companies. Engineers used bazookas to blast paths through obstacles. Infantry used them to suppress machine gun bunkers long enough for flamethrower teams to close in. In the weeks following D-Day, as Allied forces pushed through the Norman Boge country, Bazookas became essential for dealing with German armor ambushing from concealed positions. The thick hedge of Normandy created a claustrophobic battlefield, where combat occurred at ranges measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. In this environment, the bazooka's portable firepower was life-saving. But German armor was evolving. The Panther tank's sloped frontal armor could deflect even improved M63 rockets at anything but point-blank range. Tigers remained nearly impervious from the front. American soldiers learned to work in teams with riflemen suppressing enemy infantry, while bazooka teams maneuvered for side shots. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, wrote that the purpose of the bazooka was to be used as a last resort in keeping tanks from overrunning infantry with range held to around 30 yard. 30 yard, less than 100 ft. At that distance, a tank's machine guns could shred a bazooka team in seconds. The mortality rate among bazooka operators was sobering. Men assigned to anti-tank duty knew they were being asked to advance toward enemy armor that could kill them from hundreds of yards away. Yet, volunteers never lacked. One of the war's most extraordinary bazooka stories concerns Lieutenant Colonel Charles M. Carpenter, born August 29, 1912, in rural Illinois. Carpenter grew up in the small town of Reynolds near Edgington. His family lost their farmland during the Great Depression. Educated through scholarships at Roosevelt Military Academy and Center College, Kentucky, he later taught history at Moline High School before the war. He joined the Army in 1942 as a second lieutenant, completed flight training with artillery liaison wings, and arrived in France in 1944, assigned to the 4th Armored Division of General George Patton's 3rd Army as an artillery spotter and reconnaissance pilot. Carpenter flew an L-4 Grasshopper observation aircraft, serial number 43-30426, which he christened Rosie the Rocketer, in tribute to Rosie the Riveter. He mounted 6 M1A1 bazookas, later replaced by M9 models, 3 launchers on each side, fixed to plywood brackets attached to the wing struts. The total weight when armed was roughly 106 pounds. He wired them to the cockpit with an electrical firing circuit and installed a control panel with push-button triggers, allowing either single or salvo firing. Carpenter usually flew alone to maximize agility. His attack method involved diving from altitude to about 100 meters above target, releasing rockets, then sharply pulling up to evade return fire. The steep angle of attack targeted the thinner upper armor of tanks, which measured around 40-45 mm on Tiger turret tops compared to over 100 mm of frontal plating. Carpenter is officially credited with destroying 6 tanks, including 2 Tiger heavy tanks. Eyewitness reports claim as many as 14, though the confirmed figure remains 6. His first major triumph occurred on September 20, 1944, during the Battle of Aracourt, where he was credited with knocking out 1 German armored car and 4 tanks in a single day across 3 missions, expending 16 rockets. In October 1944, he eliminated 4 more tanks and 1 armored truck. Carpenter earned the Silver Star, personally presented by General George S. Patton for gallantry in ground combat, as well as the Bronze Star Medal, Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 4 battle stars, the American Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. He gained fame in Stars and Stripes. The Associated Press, Popular Science, February 1945, the New York Sun, and Liberty Magazine. In Stars and Stripes, he was quoted as saying, "Word must be spreading to watch out for cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they fire everything they have. They never used to bother cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a little." Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1946 and given a 2-year life expectancy. He returned to teaching at Urbana High School, Illinois, and survived until March 22, 1966, about 19 years beyond his prognosis. His aircraft, Rosie the Rocketer, serial 30426, was restored and has been exhibited at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts since 2020. His daughter, Carol Carpenter Aki, co-authored the 2020 biography Bazooka Charlie, The Unbelievable Story of Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer. Other notable bazooka accounts emerged from the conflict. Private First Class Francis Sherman Curry of Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, received the Medal of Honor for his actions on December 21, 1944, at Malmedy, Belgium. When German tanks overran American positions, Curry and 5 soldiers retreated into an abandoned factory. Discovering a bazooka with no ammunition, Curry dashed across the street under intense fire to retrieve rockets from a deserted half-track. His Medal of Honor citation states, "Sergeant Curry found a bazooka in the building and crossed the street to obtain rockets, enduring fierce fire from enemy tanks and infantrymen who had taken cover in a nearby house. Despite small arms, machine gun, and artillery fire, he and a comrade destroyed a tank with a single shot." Curry later remarked that, "By what I'd call a miracle, the rocket hit the exact spot where the turret joined the chassis and disabled the vehicle." Curry lived until October 8, 2019, and gave numerous interviews throughout his life. First Lieutenant Waverly Wright Deacon Ray of Company D, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, led a bazooka team against German positions near a railway bridge in Normandy in June 1944. When his rounds fell short, he seized the bazooka himself and moved closer to achieve effective range. He was struck by machine gun fire and later died of his wounds. Lieutenant Colonel Vandervoort regarded Ray as the 82nd Airborne Division's overlooked World War II equivalent of Sergeant Alvin C. York. Albert Dargo, aged 19, and a member of a 90mm anti-aircraft gun crew, volunteered with Roland Seaman on December 19, 1944, near Stoumont, Belgium, when Brass sought volunteers to counter German armor. Dargo had never fired a bazooka before. In a 2014 Washington Post interview at age 89, he recalled, "I knew I was going to get it before I got down there, but God was with me." After striking one of 4 German tanks supported by infantry, he said, "I pulled the trigger, and you never heard such a racket when that thing hit. I heard them hollering and screaming. The lieutenant told me to make sure, so I went back down with a reloaded weapon." Wilbur Bill Brunner, serving with Army engineers, used his M9 bazooka in 1945 near Dortmund, Germany, to destroy a German half-track blocking Autobahn underpasses. In a 2004 oral history with the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, he stated, "It must have had ammunition because it blew. I'd say 100 FT in the air, but it blew up. I was glad we weren't any closer than we were." On January 4, 1945, during Operation Nordwind near Rimling, France in Alsace, Jagdtiger No. 134, the heaviest armored fighting vehicle in World War II at 79 tons, was struck in vulnerable side armor by either a bazooka or M36 tank destroyer. This caused an ammunition detonation that killed the entire crew, marking the first Jagdtiger lost in combat. Despite 250 mm frontal armor that was practically invulnerable, the side armor measured only 80 mm. During the Battle of the Bulge on December 17 to 18, 1944, at the twin villages of Krinkel-Roserath and the crossroads of Lyell in the Ardennes, bazookas accounted for knocking out over 20 German armored vehicles. While not the deciding factor in the American ability to hold these key points, it demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness in desperate close combat. In the Pacific Theater, the bazooka faced different challenges. Japanese tanks were lighter and more thinly armored than German vehicles, making them easier targets. But Japanese defensive tactics emphasized bunkers, caves, and fortified positions rather than mobile armored warfare. American Marines and Army troops used bazookas primarily against fortifications. The weapon proved ideal for destroying Japanese pillboxes without requiring soldiers to close to suicidal ranges. White phosphorus rockets were particularly effective against caves and bunkers, as the burning phosphorus created toxic smoke that forced defenders out into the open. On Ewima and Okinawa, bazooka teams worked closely with flamethrower units, using rockets to blow open fortified positions that flamethrowers then cleared. However, the Pacific's climate posed unique problems. Heat and humidity wreaked havoc on the bazooka's electrical system in M1 and M1A1 models. Soldiers experienced frequent misfires. The rubber grips deteriorated rapidly. Metal components corroded despite protective coatings. The M9's magneto-ignition proved more reliable than the earlier battery system, but problems persisted. By war's end in August 1945, American forces had accumulated vast experience with shoulder-fired rocket launchers. From June 1942 through May 1945, American industry manufactured 476 628 bazookas of all models. The production breakdown was M1 with 112,790 units, produced from June 1942 to August 1943. M1A1 with 59,732 units from July to October 1943. M9 with 26,087 units from October 1943 to June 1944. M9A1 with 277,819 units from June 1944 to May 1945. 1945 and M18 with only 500 units produced from April to August 1945, of which only 350 saw combat. General Electric produced approximately 91.6% of all bazookas. Cheney Bigelow Wire Works of Springfield, Massachusetts, manufactured approximately 40,000 M9A1 launches under a June 1944 contract worth $1,863,000, winning the Army-Navy E Award 3 times during World War II. Rocket production was even more impressive. 15,063,000 rounds manufactured by war's end, including all types such as heat, practice, and smoke variants. The weapon's design made it ideal for rapid training of Allied forces. Free French forces received 11,350 units, becoming the largest foreign operator. The Soviet Union received approximately 1,000 units through Lend-Lease, though they held them in low regard compared to anti-tank rifles. Brazil received approximately 2,900 units, the United Kingdom 2,100 units, China 2,000 units, Canada approximately 170 units, and Czechoslovak insurgents received 162 units delivered via airlift during the Slovak National Uprising in September-October 1944. As the war entered its final months, a troubling reality emerged. German tanks were becoming increasingly difficult to kill with the 2.36 in bazooka. The Panther's sloped armor was resistant even to side shots unless taken at optimal angles. The Tiger II, introduced in late 1944, was essentially impervious to bazookas except at the rear. American ordnance engineers recognized the problem. In October 1944, after examining captured German Panzer Schrecks, work began on a completely redesigned weapon designated the M20 Super Bazooka. The M20 featured an 88.9 mm, 3.5 in caliber, matching the German weapon's diameter. The launcher was constructed of two-piece aluminum alloy, measured 60 in assembled or approximately 33 in disassembled, and weighed 14.3 lb unloaded. It featured a magneto-type firing device in the trigger grip and a reflecting optical sight. The M28A2 rocket could penetrate 11 in 280 meters of armor, nearly double the 2.36 inversion's capability. Effective range was 150 meters against moving targets and 275 to 300 meters against stationary targets, with a rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute. The M20 was designated in late 1944 with small-scale production beginning in 1948. Critically, the M20 saw no combat use in World War II. Development came too late. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 before the weapon could be deployed to combat units. In the Pacific, where Japanese tanks were lighter and the fighting focused more on fortifications, the original 2.36 in Bazooka remained adequate through Japan's surrender in August 1945. That expertise would prove valuable sooner than anyone expected. 5 years later, on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces equipped with approximately 150 Soviet-supplied T-3485 tanks poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea. American forces caught unprepared and under strength desperately needed weapons to stop them. South Korea had 1958 9A 12.36 in bazookas, their only anti-tank weapons in quantity. They proved critically ineffective against the T-3485's frontal armor, which measured 90 to 100 millimeters. On July 5, 1950, Task Force Smith, consisting of 406 U.S. soldiers, faced approximately 5,000 North Koreans, supported by 33 to 36 T-34 to 85 tanks. Armed with 6 M9A1 bazookas, they fired 22 rockets with zero effect on the T-34s. The rockets literally bounced off the tank armor. The task force was routed. Colonel Robert Martin of the 24th Infantry Division was killed on July 8, 1950, attempting to stop AT-34 with a 2.36 in bazooka. On July 8, 1950, day 13 of the war, General Douglas MacArthur requested urgent shipment of the M20 Super Bazooka. Rock Island Arsenal shipped the first M20s to Korea, accompanied by instructors from Fort Benning. Training manuals were hastily written in just 2 weeks. The first combat use occurred at the Battle of Tion on July 20, 1950, when the 24th Infantry Division received the first consignment. The results were immediate and dramatic. The M20 was credited with destroying 8 T-34 tanks in its first day of combat use. Time magazine reported it knocked out 7 tanks in 7 tries. Major General William F. Dean personally used the M20 against T-34s during the battle, engaging a T-34 from a second-story window Atlas than 10 yards range. He hit the turret ring, set the tank on fire, and killed the crew. Of 10 T-34s in the city that day, 6 were destroyed by M20s and 2 by artillery. Dean was later awarded the Medal of Honor, the first of the Korean War, for actions including his bazooka use. He was captured after the battle and held as a prisoner of war until September 1953. Over 750 M20s were produced and shipped to Korea in the first year. The improved M20A1 entered service in 1952 with an improved connector latch assembly and became the main production version. The M20B1 featured cast aluminum barrel and simplified internals for lighter weight. The M20A1B1 combined the M20B1 features with M2A1 improvements. Throughout the Korean War, the Super Bazooka proved its worth, destroying hundreds of enemy tanks and fortifications. But even the M20 was approaching obsolescence. Tank armor continued to improve. Shaped charge warheads required ever larger diameters to maintain penetration capability. The reloadable bazooka, requiring a 2-man team and multiple rockets, was giving way to single-use disposable launchers. By the mid-1960s, as American forces deployed to Vietnam, the bazooka era was ending. The M72 Law Light anti-armor weapon offered similar capability. In a package 1/3, the weight requiring only 1 soldier with no reloading. The bazooka soldiered on in limited use through the early years of Vietnam, particularly against fortified positions, but gradually faded from American arsenals. Yet the concept Skinner and Uhl pioneered in 1942 remains fundamental to modern infantry warfare. Every army on Earth field's shoulder-fired rocket launchers descended from the bazooka. The AT-4, the RPG-7, the M136, the Panzer Faust III, and dozens of modern weapons all trace their lineage to that crude tube, all spotted on a scrap pile. The shaped charge warhead remains the primary method for defeating tank armor at infantry ranges. The psychological impact was as important as the technical specifications. Before 1942, tanks were nearly invulnerable to individual infantrymen. The bazooka changed that calculation. Suddenly, two men with 50 lb of equipment could destroy a 50-ton vehicle. Tank crews could no longer ignore infantry. This fundamentally altered tactical doctrine. Combined arms doctrine became absolutely essential. Tanks operating without infantry cover were suicidally vulnerable. Corporal Donald E. Lewis, who participated in armor penetration tests involving a German Panther tank using both the German RPZB-54 Panzer Schreck and the US M1 Bazooka, stated, "I was so favorably impressed by the Panzer Schreck, I was ready to take after the Krauts with their own weapon." He informed superiors the Panzer Schreck was far superior to the American bazooka, demonstrating that American forces recognized the limitations of their weapon even as they used it effectively. When Leslie Skinner died on November 2, 1978, at age 78 in Clearwater, Florida, obituaries across America credited him with co-inventing one of World War II's most influential weapons. After the war, he was sent to the Pacific Theater in July 1945 to organize ordnance supply. In 1945, he was assigned to California Institute of Technology to establish an ordnance sub-office. He retired from the Army as a colonel in 1948 with the Legion of Merit, then joined Aerojet Engineering Corporation in Rancho Cordova, California. In 1950, he was recalled for the Korean War and commissioned in the U.S. Air Force, establishing a weapons test facility at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, from 1950 to 1952. After his second military retirement, in 1952, he worked as a consultant for Oerlikon Group Weapons Manufacturing until 1970. He then moved to Bear Bluffs, Florida, and took up sculpture, channeling his creative energy into art. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery and received the Hickman Award from the American Rocket Society. Edward Uwa lived longer, passing away on May 9, 2010 at age 92 in Oxford, Maryland from complications of a stroke. After leaving the U.S. Army in 1947 as lieutenant colonel, he worked for Glenn L. Martin Company, then Martin Marietta from 1947 to 1959 on guided missile projects, eventually becoming Vice President of Engineering. From 1959 to 1961, he served as Vice President of Ryan Aeronautical Company. In 1961, Ull joined Fairchild Engine and Airplane Company, later Fairchild Industries, as president. He was named chairman in 1976. From 1961 to 1985, he oversaw the transformation from military aircraft manufacturer to aerospace Fortune 500 company. Major programs under his leadership included the Matador Bullpup and Persing missiles, the F-105 and A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, and the Pegasus ATS-6 and TDRS satellites. He retired as chairman in 1985. UL married Maureen Barbara Kelleher in 1943 and had 4 children, including 2 sons, who attended his alma mater, Leahy University. In interviews during his final years, maintained that the bazooka's success came from necessity and direct problem-solving. "We really had no anti-tank weapon," he told Maryland Cracker Barrel magazine in 2007. "You can't believe how inept our military was at that point in time." That statement carried weight. The American military of 1941 was woefully unprepared for modern warfare. By 1945, it was the most powerful military force in human history. Weapons like the bazooka made that transformation possible. In 1985, at a reunion in Germany for veterans of the European campaign, a remarkable moment occurred. A former German Panther tank commander approached an American veteran who had carried a bazooka through France and Germany. Through a translator, the German said, "We feared your tube rocket more than your tanks. Your Sherman tanks we could destroy easily, but your rockets They came from anywhere, from soldiers we could not see until too late. Many times we abandoned tanks that were not damaged just because we heard the sound of your rockets nearby. The American asked why. The German smiled sadly, because we knew that the next rocket might come through our vision slot, or strike our engine, or catch us from behind. We were always looking over our shoulders. The fear was worse than the weapon. This psychological impact, the constant threat perception, was perhaps the bazooka's greatest achievement. German tank crews who had once terrorized Europe suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of terror. The bazooka's impact went far beyond the front lines. The shaped charge warhead concept became a cornerstone for demolition work, mining, and industrial cutting. The rocket propulsion technology pioneered for the bazooka directly influenced post-war missile engineering. Scientists and technicians who had developed bazooka rockets during the conflict carried that experience into guided missile programs of the 1950s and 1960s. French resistance fighters, who obtained bazookas through Allied supply drops, discovered them invaluable for ambushing German convoys, requiring almost no formal training for partisan groups unable to organize structured instruction. By the 21st century, shoulder-launched rocket systems had advanced far beyond anything Skinner and Uhl could have envisioned. Modern launchers incorporate tandem warheads to defeat reactive armor, precision guidance for extended range, and integrated electronic systems. Weapons such as the M3 Carl Gustav, the FGM-148 Javelin, and the NL Audio represent successive generations of refinement. Yet soldiers still call them bazookas. The name has become universal, symbolizing an entire class of portable anti-armor weapons. Historians examining the bazooka's creation often remark on what didn't occur. No lengthy committee reviews, no multi-year design cycles, no exhaustive field testing. It was simply a weapon that worked well enough, built fast enough, and issued widely enough to make a decisive difference. The contrast with modern weapons development is striking. Today's systems often take decades to move from idea to battlefield, costing billions. The original bazooka cost barely $50 to produce, and any soldier could service it in the field. At factories such as General Electric, where bazookas were mass-produced, most of the workforce consisted of women, part of the Rosie the Riveter generation whose labor powered the Allied war machine. These workers knew their efforts directly supported troops overseas, often including their own relatives. Quality control took on a moral weight, and defect rates stayed remarkably low. Despite frantic production schedules, the bazooka provided infantry with a weapon they had never possessed before. And that tool saved countless lives. No longer did soldiers have to rely on suicidal charges against tanks armed only with explosives. They could now fight from a safer distance with a realistic chance of success. That change, from helplessness to empowerment, may have been the bazooka's greatest contribution. It proved that groundbreaking innovation doesn't always demand years of research or enormous budgets. Sometimes, it only takes an engineer spotting a piece of scrap metal, an open-minded superior, and a willingness to experiment. Skinner and Uhl never set out to revolutionize warfare. They were tackling a straightforward problem with limited materials and urgent deadlines. Yet their creation became one of the war's most consequential inventions, showing that effectiveness often comes from simplicity. The bazooka remains a testament to American ingenuity under pressure. It wasn't refined or elegant. It certainly wasn't flawless, but it was effective, affordable, and produced in time to help change the course of the war. The soldiers who shouldered bazookas in combat seldom thought about history. Their focus was on survival, protecting their comrades, and completing the mission. To them, the bazooka was just a tool, but it was a tool that transformed them from victims of mechanized warfare into fighters who could strike back. That transformation, repeated countless times across every theater of World War II, defined the bazooka's true legacy, not the statistics, production totals, or destroyed tanks, But the confidence it gave to ordinary soldiers, the conviction that they were not powerless, that they could fight and prevail against even the most formidable enemy machines. When Edward Ull walked past that pile of scrap metal in 1942 and spotted a discarded steel tube, he unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would reshape modern warfare. A crude prototype fired into the Potomac River, a field demonstration using improvised sights, a rushed production order, global deployment, millions of rockets launched, thousands of enemy vehicles destroyed, and tens of thousands of American lives preserved. All because a young engineer understood that sometimes the simplest idea is the most powerful one.